Some threads feel like harmless entertainment until the updates stop and the comments start panicking. You're on LurmoStories, where we follow those trails to the last known post. Stay with me. The last story ends exactly where the first one begins. It was the dead of winter when I first started working in the basement stacks of the university's library. I had just entered graduate school and, in typical fashion, took on a job that seemed easy enough to fit around my studies. The basement archives, with its rows upon rows of neglected shelves, was a perfect place for me to focus. Quiet, out of the way. Most of the undergrads didn't know it existed, and the graduate students who did would only come down here for research on rare, old texts. Perfect for me, I thought. The basement smelled of old books, but there was an undertone of something heavier. Dust, mildew, something faintly rancid that I couldn't place. It wasn't unpleasant at first, it was just old. And it was the kind of atmosphere that, for someone who spent hours poring over texts, felt almost comforting. I'd sit for hours, my desk nestled in between a labyrinth of shelves, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows on the concrete floors. The rows of old, leather-bound volumes seemed to hum with a kind of dull energy, but it wasn't oppressive, more like a whisper that faded as quickly as it came. Most of the time, the basement was completely empty. I could hear the occasional murmur from the main library floor, but it never lasted long. The stacks down here were far removed from everything else. It was always just me, the books, and the low hum of the heating system struggling against the chill. Even the janitors avoided this area. They'd do their rounds upstairs, but never ventured near the basement. I think it had something to do with the old wiring or the cramped space, but no one really cared enough to ask. At first, everything was fine. I'd sit at my desk, skimming through texts, making notes, cataloging obscure manuscripts that were all but forgotten. Sometimes, when I needed a break, I'd wander through the aisles, looking at the covers, feeling the weight of centuries-old knowledge pressing against my fingertips. There was something calming about the atmosphere, something almost sacred about the way the rows of books were arranged. Even though there wasn't much foot traffic down there, I'd occasionally see another grad student passing through, always with a specific purpose. They were the rare exceptions. Mostly, the basement was mine. But after a few weeks, something started to change. It wasn't immediately obvious, just subtle shifts in the air, like a layer of tension settling over the room. I remember the first time I noticed it. The hum of the lights above me had always been constant. It was the kind of sound you'd forget about unless you really paid attention to it. But one day, I realized it had stopped. I thought it was just another flicker in the wiring, maybe even a burnt-out bulb. But when I looked up at the overhead lights, I saw that they were still on. The humming was just gone. I tried to ignore it. There were always other distractions, papers to grade, books to read, 1,000 other things I could bury myself in. But then, when I turned to the page of the book I was reading, I realized something else. It was eerily quiet. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. It wasn't like the normal quiet of a library, where there's the distant murmur of conversation, the rustle of paper, the subtle squeak of shoes on the floor. No, this was different. It was absolute. The kind of silence that pressed in on you from all sides. A vacuum that made you feel like you were suffocating, even if you didn't realize it at first. The air felt thicker too. Not the heavy, stale air of the basement, but something else, something oppressive. It was as though the weight of the old books was bearing down on me more heavily than before. I couldn't pinpoint it, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. The hairs on the back of my neck prickling, as though I wasn't truly alone. Over the next few days, it got worse. The silence became louder, somehow, suffocating me. The basement's usual isolation had shifted, becoming something far more unsettling. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. I noticed that the temperature had dropped too, despite the heater struggling against the cold. I was bundled up in a sweater and jacket, and yet my breath came out in soft, visible clouds. The cold wasn't normal. It wasn't like the chill of winter that crept into every corner of the campus. This felt isolated, contained, as if it was just within the walls of this basement, refusing to leave. I started to notice something else, too. Every time I'd wander through the stacks, I'd find the books had been moved. Not much, just a few inches out of place, a book slightly ajar, a row shifted ever so slightly. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, the library's basement was barely used. Who could have been down there moving things around? I checked the security cameras, but they only covered the main floors. No one ever came down to the basement. The idea that it was me, that I was subconsciously moving things in my sleep, didn't sit right with me either. But then, one afternoon, I came back to find that the books were arranged differently. A set of shelves, one that I had passed just the day before, now had a row of books that weren't supposed to be there. I knew the layout well. I had spent hours down here, memorizing every aisle and corner. These weren't books I had seen before, not like this. I pulled one off the shelf, expecting to find it covered in dust, but it was pristine, brand new. The title was in a language I didn't recognize. I flipped through the pages, and they were blank. Every single page, just blank paper. That's when I started feeling truly unsettled. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing supernatural about the books. They weren't haunted or cursed. They were just out of place. But the feeling in the room, the weight, the silence, it was all growing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just the books being moved or the strange cold air. There was something about the way the basement felt, as if it had become aware of me, watching me. I didn't sleep well for the next few nights. I spent most of my time down in the basement, trying to work, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But the more I stayed, the more oppressive it became. The silence was so thick that even my thoughts seemed muted, like they were swallowed up by the heavy air. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. It was like everything was pressing in on me. One night, as I was about to leave, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps. But there was no one else down here. I darted to the door, my heart racing, but when I opened it, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. The hallway that led to the stairs, to the safety of the main library, where there was always light and sound. I didn't stay long that night. I packed up my things and left. I promised myself I wouldn't come back. But the next morning, I was back. The archives were waiting for me, like they knew I couldn't stay away. And now, I'm not sure how to leave. The silence is louder now, the cold is deeper, and the books, they've started to move again. I've always been a creature of habit. Same routine every week. Friday nights, I'd go to the late screening at the old cinema on the corner of 8th and Pine. It was a small, run-down place, but there was something charming about it. The walls were peeling, the carpets were threadbare, and the air smelled faintly of stale popcorn and ancient upholstery. But it was familiar. It was mine. I'd sit in the last row, middle seat, and watch whatever film was playing. I wasn't picky. I didn't care for the latest releases or the reviews, just the comfort of dark silence after a week of noise and chaos. That Friday felt no different from any other. The film was forgettable, a cheap slasher flick with too many cliches and a plot so thin you could see right through it. But I didn't mind. I sat back, sunk into the cracked, velvet-covered seat, and let the sound of the movie drown out the world. It was nearly midnight when the credits began to roll. A small group of people shuffled out, the usual stragglers, leaving behind the faint scent of popcorn and the rustle of their coats. I waited until the theater was empty before I got up to leave. The exit was on the far side of the theater, near the back. The usual exit, the one everyone used. But there was a strange vibe to the place tonight. The air was heavy, thick with something that didn't sit right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt a kind of unease creeping up my spine as I walked toward the door. The flickering light from the exit sign above me seemed to stutter, like a faulty bulb, casting unsettling shadows across the hallway. I reached the door and pulled on the handle. The door didn't open immediately. It was one of those heavy metal doors that you had to tug at a little before it would give. I hadn't thought much about it until now, but it felt oddly resistant, like something was pressing against it from the other side. When it finally creaked open, I stepped out into the cool, damp air behind the theater. The alley was the same as always, dark, narrow, and quiet. There was a small stretch of concrete that led to the street, the back of the building looming on one side, and a rusted dumpster at the far end of the alley. But tonight, the alley felt different. At first, it was just a subtle shift in the air, a strange, almost magnetic pull in the atmosphere that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I glanced over my shoulder, back toward the theater, but the door was already closing behind me, the heavy thud of it reverberating through the space. I turned back to the alley, confused by the sudden sense of isolation. This was a part of town I knew well. I'd walked this alley countless times, and yet tonight, something felt wrong. The streetlights were out, leaving the alley dim and ominous. I glanced around for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the usual shadows creeping in from the corners. I was about to walk toward the street, ready to shrug off my unease, when I noticed something strange. The dumpster at the far end of the alley was pushed further out than usual. It wasn't much, just a couple of feet, but it was enough to catch my attention. I walked toward it, drawn by a need to check. As I passed the dumpster, I stopped short. The back of the theater, where there should have been nothing but brick, was open, a narrow black gap in the wall. The building itself seemed to stretch beyond the alley, a hidden door where one shouldn't be. I stood there for a moment, blinking, trying to understand what I was seeing. I told myself it was just the dark playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd never noticed it before, or maybe it had been hidden behind the dumpster all this time. I wasn't sure. But that didn't explain why the door seemed to lead to an entirely different part of the building, one I had never seen before. I hesitated, then took a step closer, my shoes scraping against the gritty pavement. The door was ajar, just slightly, and as I peered inside, I could see nothing but blackness. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my chest tightening with the strange sensation that I was being watched. My rational mind told me to turn around, go back to the street, and forget all about it. But something else, something far deeper, urged me forward. I took a step inside. It wasn't like any space I'd expected. The interior was stark, cold, and eerily silent. No echoing footsteps, no distant hum of air conditioning, just dead silence. The walls, like the ones in the theater, were peeling and chipped, but the space felt far more unnerving. A long hallway stretched ahead of me, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights that barely held on to their last breath. I could feel the air growing heavier, like the weight of it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. My heart was beating faster now, thudding in my chest as I inched forward. The hallway was lined with doors, closed, unmarked, and seemingly insignificant. I tried to convince myself it was just a maintenance area, but the deeper I went, the more the space felt wrong, as if the entire building was shifting around me. Then I heard it. A faint sound from behind one of the doors, soft but unmistakable. A shuffling, a dragging noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I stopped, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, staring at the door where the sound had come from. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and walk back into the alley, back to the street, where everything felt familiar. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me there, tethered to that spot, drawn toward whatever was on the other side of that door. Another noise. This time, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of something trying to breathe, but failing. A sound that felt almost alive. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of it, vibrating slightly as if the entire building was reacting to whatever was in there. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, my mind screaming at me to stop. But I couldn't. The curiosity, the pull, was too strong. With a quick motion, I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was dim, barely lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The space was empty, save for a chair in the middle of the room. The floor was covered in dust, untouched by time. But there, in the corner of the room, something was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it more clearly. A figure, hunched over, dragging itself across the floor. It wasn't human, not in any way that I could recognize. The figure stopped, its head lifting slowly, revealing a face twisted and distorted, eyes wide and unblinking. It stared at me, unseeing, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound ringing in my ears. I stepped backward, stumbling, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in that room with whatever it was. I looked around, frantic, trying to find an escape, but the walls were closing in. The shadows in the room were growing longer, darker, more alive, as though the very fabric of reality was warping around me. And then I heard it, clear as day. A voice, soft and whispering, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Leave. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. With every ounce of strength, I slammed my body against the door, the metal bending under the pressure. Finally, the door creaked open, and I bolted into the hallway, running, not daring to look back. The noise behind me, footsteps, dragging, breathing, followed, growing louder with each step. I didn't stop running until I was back in the alley, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The door to the alley had closed behind me, the rusted metal never having been there before. I walked back to the street, still not understanding what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The night air had never tasted so cold, and the world had never felt so wrong. And as I turned the corner, I realized something else. I would never, ever be able to find that alley again. I'm not one for malls. I never really liked the noise, the endless displays of shiny things I couldn't afford, and the crowds, always bustling around, some with their heads buried in their phones, others just aimlessly walking, almost like they were programmed to do it. But that day, I needed a new pair of shoes. Something simple, functional, and, above all, on sale. It was one of those rare weekends where I didn't have much going on, so I figured I'd swing by the department store and knock out a few errands. The mall was busy as usual, and the usual discomfort I felt in places like this started to bubble up. The air smelled faintly of food court grease and cheap perfume, and I could hear the muted hum of the escalators, always a familiar, somewhat comforting sound, as if the mall was alive in some strange, mechanical way. I walked past a few stores, then saw the department store on the left. The bright fluorescent lights beckoned me in, and despite the mild irritation bubbling in my chest, I pushed the glass doors open and stepped inside. It was one of those sprawling stores, the kind that seemed to have everything you needed and a whole lot more you didn't. Shoes, clothes, gadgets, knickknacks, everything you could imagine. It was busy, but not unbearable. I moved past a display of scented candles, their sweet, artificial smells making my head spin, and then found myself walking toward the escalators. I always hated how loud escalators were, how their constant hum vibrated through my spine. It wasn't the sound of movement that bothered me, it was the idea of it. These steps were forever rising or descending, endlessly looping in some sort of mechanical loop. They felt unnatural to me, as if they were trying to pull you into their rhythm, whether you liked it or not. I guess I've always had a weird relationship with escalators. I've never liked being on one when it's crowded, but today, it was quieter than usual. As I stepped closer, I realized something strange. The escalator to the second floor, right in front of me, wasn't moving. I blinked, stepped forward, and examined the metal structure a little more closely. The usual steps that would be constantly shifting, gliding upwards, were missing. There was nothing but smooth metal in their place. For a split second, I thought I'd misjudged the angle. I wasn't great with escalators, and maybe I was standing at the wrong spot. I took another step forward, looking closer. There was no step, no place for a foot to land. The metal structure of the escalator was intact, but it was bare. Not a single step, just a flat, almost disturbingly clean surface stretching upwards. My pulse started to pick up as I scanned the edges, almost expecting to see the usual worn marks on the steps where people's shoes had left imprints. Nothing. Not a single mark. Like this escalator had been untouched, abandoned in a hurry. I paused. Something about it wasn't right. Escalators were designed to have steps. They didn't just suddenly lose them. I looked around. A few people walked past me, oblivious to what I was staring at. I wanted to ask someone if they'd noticed, but I couldn't find the words. I wanted to check the sign on the escalator to see if it said something about maintenance, but the whole thing was still lit, still humming faintly, as if it was functioning normally, except for the fact that it wasn't. The discomfort I felt was mounting now, shifting into a sense of unease that crawled up my spine. I slowly took a few steps back, my eyes darting from the empty escalator to the surrounding area. The other escalator nearby was moving, with people calmly ascending. But this one was just wrong. I decided to leave it alone. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe I was tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But something about it wasn't normal. As I turned, I heard something. It was faint at first, just barely audible over the noise of the mall. But then it grew louder. A noise, steady, rhythmic, the kind of noise that shouldn't have been coming from an escalator, or at least not from one that wasn't running. It was the sound of footsteps. I turned back toward the escalator. The sound was unmistakable now, louder, faster, almost hurrying as if someone was running up the steps. But the escalator was still motionless, the surface smooth and uninterrupted. And then I saw it. A foot. Just a single foot emerged from the empty space where the steps should have been. It didn't appear from any obvious place, it was just there. A foot, not attached to anything, slowly moving upwards. It didn't look natural. It was as if it was floating, like some force was pulling it along the escalator. There was no step, but it was as if the foot was rising anyway, dragged upward by some unseen force. I couldn't move. The foot kept rising inch by inch, like it was trying to step on something that wasn't there. Then another foot, and another. The pair slowly moved higher, dragging themselves into the empty space above, moving in a way that was impossible. I couldn't tear my eyes away, couldn't even breathe. The horrifying realization settled in. Someone was climbing this escalator, and they didn't need steps to do it. A shiver ran through me. I stumbled backward, feeling the cool, sterile air of the department store brush against my face. There was no one else around the escalator now. People were too busy browsing clothes, staring at their phones, lost in their own worlds, unaware of what was happening right in front of them. The footsteps kept coming. Not slow or steady, desperate. Like whoever or whatever was climbing the escalator had to reach the top. It wasn't an ascent of choice. It was as if they were being dragged to the top, against their will. The footfalls echoed, filling the space around me, each step louder and more frantic. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. I turned around, ready to flee, but then I heard it, clear as day, a voice, low, grating, unmistakable. You're next. I whipped around, but the escalator was empty. The steps were still gone. The footfalls had stopped. I looked around, frantic, searching for anyone else who might have seen what had just happened. But the mall was still as it had been, busy but lifeless in its own way. I stumbled toward the exit, my feet pounding the tile floor. I needed to get out. I had to. I was almost at the door when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Only now, they were coming from all directions, not just the escalator. The whole mall felt alive, like something was crawling beneath its shiny, polished surface. As I reached the door, I glanced back one final time. The escalator stood as it had before, empty, but for the first time I noticed something new, the faintest smudge of a footprint, trailing off into the metal. This was LurmoStories, where user deleted never means the fear is gone. The next time you see that line under a profile, you'll wonder what they were trying to outrun.